February 8, 1965, 1014 p.m., 22 West Restaurant, 22 West 135th Street. The air inside the restaurant was thick enough to choke a man, heavy with the scent of stale tobacco, fried grease, and impending death. It wasn't the food that killed you in Harlem, it was the silence. And right now, the silence at the back booth of 22 West was louder than the subway rumbling beneath Lenox Avenue. Two men sat opposite each other. One was a king of the underworld, a man whose name stopped heartbeats from 1/10th to the Polo Grounds. The other was a prophet, a man whose words were currently setting a world on fire. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson placed a single, manicured hand on the formica table. He didn't look at the menu. He looked at the red-haired preacher sitting across from him. "They are going to kill you, Red," Bumpy said. His voice was low, a gravel slide of absolute certainty. "Not maybe. Not next year. They are going to kill you before the snow melts." The stakes on the table weren't chips or cash. The stake was the life of Malcolm X. Bumpy pushed a folded napkin forward. It wasn't empty. It contained a list of 6 names, his best shooters. The leg breakers, men who didn't sleep and didn't miss. "Take them," Bumpy commanded, his eyes narrowing into slits of obsidian. "They stand outside your house. They stand inside the ballroom. You say the word, they drop the hammer." Malcolm looked at the napkin. He looked at the 6 men spread out around the restaurant, Bumpy's personal guard, who are currently watching the front door like hawks watching a field of mice. The preacher smiled, a tired, weary smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I cannot," Malcolm whispered. The refusal hung in the air like a gunshot echo. Bumpy Johnson, the man who had once made a Frank Costello hitman lower a weapon with 3 words, stared in disbelief. He knew something Malcolm didn't. He knew the order had already been given. He knew the price had been paid. And he knew that, by saying no, the most dangerous man in America had just signed his own death warrant. 3 years earlier, to understand why this refusal was a suicide note, you have to understand the man making the offer. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. By the 1960s, he was the jagged spine of Harlem. He had survived the Dutch Schultz Wars of the 30s, outmaneuvered the Italian families in the 40s, and had just returned from a decade-long vacation in Alcatraz, the Rock, from 1952 to 1963. While he was away, the streets had changed. Heroin had flooded the veins of the neighborhood, and the code of honor Bumpy lived by was eroding. But Bumpy was still Bumpy. He walked with a limp, carried a cane that doubled as a weapon, and possessed an intellect that rivaled any university professor. He was a chess master who played with human pawns. Harlem in early 1965 was a pressure cooker with a welded lid. The civil rights movement was fracturing. The optimism of the early 60s was curdling into rage. On one side, you had the nonviolent integrationists. On the other, the rising tide of black power. And standing alone on a jagged precipice was Malcolm X. He had split from the Nation of Islam, NOI, in March 1964. It wasn't an amicable divorce. It was a schism that tore families and the community apart. Malcolm was exposing the corruption of the NOI leadership, and in doing so, he had gone from their greatest asset to their greatest liability. The tension on 125th Street was palpable. You could feel it on your skin like humidity. It wasn't just the police watching. It was the brothers in the boaties selling Muhammad Speaks on the corners. Their eyes were cold. The Whisper Network, the telegraph of the streets that Bumpy Johnson controlled, was buzzing with a singular frequency: silence the traitor. Bumpy had ears in the mosques and eyes in the police precincts. He knew the FBI was watching, waiting for the implosion. He knew the NYPD's Bureau of Special Services, BOSS, was tracking every move. But more importantly, Bumpy knew the mechanics of a hit. He saw the patterns forming the dry runs, the intimidation tactics, the firebombings. He recognized the smell of blood in the water because he had been a shark for 30 years. The enemy facing Malcolm wasn't a singular villain twirling a mustache. It was a 3-headed hydra, terrifying in its scope and reach. First, there was the hierarchy of the Nation of Islam, specifically the Newark Mosque and the Fruit of Islam, FOI, enforcers who viewed Malcolm as a Judas. They were disciplined, martial, and fiercely loyal to Elijah Muhammad. They weren't street thugs, they were true believers, which made them infinitely more dangerous. A man fighting for money might hesitate. A man fighting for God never blinks. Second, there was the shadow government, the FBI, and local law enforcement. They had Malcolm under constant surveillance. They tapped his phones, trailed his car, and sowed discord within his organization. They didn't need to pull the trigger themselves. They just needed to clear the lane for those who would. They wanted Malcolm removed from the board just as much as his former brothers did. But the specific antagonist Bumpy worried about wasn't an ideology, it was the mechanics of the operation. Bumpy knew there was a kill squad being assembled. The word on the street was a bounty-specific numbers floating in the smoky backrooms of pool halls. $5,000. 10,000. The numbers meant professional work. This wasn't going to be a random mugging. This was a sanctioned execution. Bumpy had seen the dossier of threats, the car chase on the expressway, the menacing phone calls to Betty Shabazz. The direct threat to Bumpy was existential. Malcolm was his friend. They had known each other since the 1940s, back when Malcolm was Detroit Red, a street hustler running numbers and steering clear of trouble. Bumpy had watched Red transform into Malcolm, seen the hustler become the leader. To let him die on Bumpy's watch, in Bumpy's territory, was an insult to Bumpy's power. It was a challenge to his sovereignty. If Bumpy Johnson couldn't protect the most important black man in America in the middle of Harlem, was he really the king? February 14, 1965, 2 a.m. The setup for the final tragedy began with fire. A Molotov cocktail shattered the front window of Malcolm's home in East Elmhurst, Queens, while his wife and daughter slept inside. They barely escaped with their lives, standing in the freezing snow as their sanctuary burned. This was the escalation point. This was the signal flare. Bumpy requested the sit down immediately after the fire. He didn't ask, he summoned. He chose a neutral ground, a place where he controlled the exits and the staff 22 West. When Malcolm walked in that afternoon of February 8th, the timeline overlaps with the escalating violence. The atmosphere inside the diner shifted. The clatter of silverware died down. The jukebox seemed to lower its volume. Bumpy was already seated at the rear booth, his back against the wall, eyes scanning the entrance. He wore a charcoal gray suit, impeccably pressed, a diamond pinky ring catching the dim yellow light of the diner. The sensory details of the meeting were suffocating. The smell of burnt coffee and Old Spice aftershave, the tactile grit of the table surface. Bumpy watched Malcolm sit. The preacher looked exhausted. His skin was pale, his eyes rimmed with red, shadows stretching long across his face. He carried the weight of a man who had seen his own ghost. "They missed your babies by 6 feet, Red," Bumpy started, skipping the pleasantries. His voice was a low rumble like distant thunder. "It is a test," Malcolm replied, his voice raspy. "Allah tests those he loves. Allah isn't holding the gasoline can," Bumpy snapped, leaning forward. "Men are. Men with names. Men with addresses." At 1:22 p.m., a waitress approached to refill coffee. Bumpy halted her with a single, sharp look. She retreated instantly. The zone of privacy was absolute. "I have 12 men," Bumpy said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more force than a shout. 12. Not street punks. Professionals. I have them stationed at the Teresa. I have them ready to circle the Audubon. They will carry pieces. They will watch the doors. Anyone who looks sideways at you gets put in the ground. Malcolm stirred his black coffee, the spoon clinking against the ceramic clink, clink. "I cannot have men with guns around me, Bumpy. The press. They are waiting for me to turn violent. If I am surrounded by gangsters, I validate everything the media says about me. I become a thug. I lose the moral high ground. The moral high ground is a graveyard." Bumpy slammed his hand on the table, a rare display of emotion. The silverware rattled. "You think these cats care about your morals? They want you dead, Malcolm. I'm offering you a shield, a steel shield." "I am a man of peace," Malcolm said softly. "You are a man of war who forgot how to fight," Bumpy countered. He pulled the napkin with the names back slightly, then pushed it forward again. "Remember 1949? Remember the Italians?" A hitter from the Genovese family walked into the Lenox lounge. He had a .38 aimed at my chest for 8 minutes. 8 minutes, Red. I didn't reach for a gun. I looked him in the eye and told him, "If you drop me, my men will burn your mother's house down with her inside it." He lowered the gun. "That is power. That is what you need right now. Fear. You need them to fear you." "I need them to hear me," Malcolm said, pushing the napkin back. The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical. The diner seemed to hold its breath. Bumpy Johnson, the man who controlled the lottery, the heroin, and the protection rackets of Harlem sat frozen. He was offering the ultimate gift life, and it was being rejected. "If you don't take these men," Bumpy said, his voice devoid of emotion now, "you are dead within 2 weeks." "Then it is written," Malcolm replied, standing up. He buttoned his coat. "It was good to see you, Bumpy." What Malcolm didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson didn't accept no when the stakes were life and death. Bumpy was a strategist who operated 3 moves ahead of the board. As Malcolm walked out of 22 West, Bumpy signaled to his lieutenant, a massive man named Junie Bird. Bumpy's move wasn't to respect Malcolm's wishes. It was to protect him covertly. Bumpy knew he couldn't put men on the stage with Malcolm, but he could sanitize the room. February 15th through February 20th. Bumpy activated his network. He didn't send bodyguards, he sent hunters. He sent men into the local mosques in Harlem and fierce loyalists into the bars on 16th Street. Their job was to intercept, on February 18th, inside the darker corners of the Smalls Paradise basement. Bumpy's men cornered 2 low-level soldiers from a rival faction who had been talking too loud about a big event on Sunday. Bumpy's message was delivered with a tire iron and a warning: stay away from the Audubon. But here was the twist. The tragic irony that Bumpy, for all his power, couldn't control. Bumpy had locked down Harlem. He had the local crews terrified to touch a hair on Malcolm's head. He had secured his territory, but the hit squad wasn't coming from Harlem. Bumpy sat in his office at the Palmetto Chemical Company, his front business, reviewing intelligence. He had the ace of spades in his hand, total control of the local threat. He made a phone call to a contact in the NYPD. "If anything happens to Red," Bumpy told the captain, "the city burns." He thought he had checkmated the board. But the assassins were coming from Newark, New Jersey. They were coming from outside Bumpy's direct sphere of immediate intimidation. And worse, on the day of the speech, the police detail that usually stood outside the Audubon Ballroom, the detail Bumpy assumed would be the second line of defense, vanished. Bumpy's move was a masterclass in local control. He had cleared the streets of Harlem of any local shooters. He had intimidated the local hustlers. He had, in his mind, created a safe zone. But he couldn't protect Malcolm from the one thing Bumpy never accounted for: a system that would pull back the police protection at the exact moment the out-of-town wolves arrived. February 21st, 1965, 3:10 p.m. The phone rang in Bumpy Johnson's apartment. It wasn't a business call, it was Junie Bird. "They got him, Bump." 3 words. The same number of words Bumpy used to stop the Costello hitman, but these 3 words shattered the world. "Where?" Bumpy asked, staring at the wall. "The Audubon. Shotguns. Handguns." It was a slaughter, Bump, right in front of his wife. Bumpy hung up the phone. He didn't scream. He didn't flip the desk. He walked to the window and looked out at Lenox Avenue. The gray winter sky looked like dirty wool. People below were already running, crying, gathering in knots of confusion and rage. The shockwave was hitting the street. The aftermath was immediate and chaotic. The ripple effects tore through the underworld. Bumpy ordered his entire organization to go to Mattress's total lockdown. He expected riots. He expected war. That night, the 28th Precinct was barricaded. The Apollo Theater marquee went dark. But in the back rooms of the Lenox Lounge, the mood was funereal. The gangsters, the hustlers, the pimpsmen who lived by violence were shaken. Malcolm was their prince, even if he denounced their lifestyle. He was the one man who told the white man the truth to his face, and he was gone. Bumpy's position had changed instantly. He had failed. He hadn't failed in business, but he had failed in friendship. The invincibility of Bumpy Johnson took a hit if he couldn't save Malcolm, who was safe. However, in the days that followed, a terrifying silence fell over the specific crew for New Jersey. Rumors circulated, dark, unsubstantiated rumors, that Bumpy had reached out, that while the police were fumbling the investigation, Bumpy's justice was seeking balance. But officially, Bumpy sat in the Lenox Lounge, staring at a glass of scotch he didn't drink, mourning the only man he respected who wouldn't take his help. The refusal of Malcolm X to accept Bumpy Johnson's men is one of the great what-ifs of the 20th century. If those 12 men had been at the Audubon Ballroom, standing guard with bulge coats and icy stares, the 3 assassins from Newark likely never would have made it past the lobby. The shotguns would have remained under their coats. Malcolm would have lived to see 1966. This story reveals the complex duality of Bumpy Johnson. He was a criminal, yes, a violent man, but he possessed a code of loyalty that transcended the law. He understood that power without protection is just vanity. He saw the world as it was a place of wolves, while Malcolm, in his final days, was trying to see the world as it should be. The lesson etched in the blood on the Audubon stage is timeless. Idealism needs a shield. You cannot fight a war with words alone when the enemy is bringing shotguns. Bumpy knew that to change the world, you first have to survive it. He offered Malcolm the survival kit, and Malcolm chose martyrdom. If this story showed you why Bumpy Johnson was more than just a gangster, but a strategic genius who tried to save history, hit that subscribe button. We're diving deep into the Harlem underworld every week. Drop a like if you respect the code of the streets, and tell me in the comments, if you were Malcolm, would you have taken Bumpy's offer, or was he right to refuse? Next week we're covering the time Lucky Luciano tried to tax Harlem, and Bumpy sent him a box of raw steaks as a warning. You don't want to miss it.